January 1778. Just before dawn, a Hawaiian fisherman looks up from his canoe and sees a thing that cannot exist. Something enormous is rising out of the black ocean. It is taller than anything that floats. It has great white wings stretched against the fading stars and points of fire burning along the top of it. It moves against the wind, and nothing moves against the wind. It does not belong to any story he has ever been told. He has no word for ship, so his mind reaches for the only thing large enough to explain it. A floating island. A temple torn loose from the land and set adrift. Something from the world of the gods. He turns his canoe and paddles hard for shore, leaving his nets behind in the water. The man standing on the deck of that impossible thing is James Cook, the greatest navigator alive. He has already mapped more of the earth than any human in history. He has crossed the Pacific twice and sailed farther south than anyone had ever survived. And now, completely by accident, on his way to search for a passage across the top of the world, he has blundered into a chain of islands no European knew existed. One of the last hidden places left on Earth. He thinks he's stopping for water and fresh food. He thinks this is a small moment in a much bigger voyage. He could not be more wrong. Because in exactly 1 year, on the shore of one of these islands, the greatest explorer of his age will be struck down in the shallows and killed, and the people who kill him will not be sure, even as they do it, whether they are killing a man or a god. That is where we're going tonight, but not the way the history books take you there. You might know the ending already, in the blurry way everyone half knows these things. Captain Cook, the great explorer, killed on a beach in Hawaii, a brave man, a sudden fight, a tragedy in paradise. That is the polished version, the classroom version, and it hides the strangest part of the whole story, because the real question is not how Cook died, it is what the Hawaiians thought he was, and whether he ever understood the answer. What if the people who came to meet Cook did not see a man at all? What if they fed him, bowed to him, and carried him to their most sacred temple because they believed a god had returned to them, exactly as their calendar had foretold? And what if Cook himself, a hard, practical butcher's son from Yorkshire who trusted charts and numbers and almost nothing else, never grasped what he had sailed into the middle of? What if the most important thing about Cook in Hawaii was not what he discovered, but what he was mistaken for? And what if that mistake is the thing that killed him? If you're listening to this to fall asleep, that is exactly what this journey is made for. So settle in. And if you feel like it, leave a comment and tell me where in the world you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. It's a strange and lovely thing to picture someone in Honolulu with the ocean outside the window, someone in London long after midnight, someone in Cairo with the city humming softly in the dark, all drifting toward the same distant shore tonight. We're going back more than 200 years, not to the heroic portrait and the simple tragedy, but to the real texture of it, the first sight of the ships, the 10,000 people who gathered on the water to see a god arrive, the sacred season that made it all possible, and the terrible turn when that season ended, and the god slowly began to look like an ordinary, mortal, disappointing man. We're going to meet the Hawaiians, not as extras on a beach, but as a people with their own gods, their own calendar, their own politics, and their own reasons for everything they did. We're going to follow Cook as a simple stop for water becomes something no chart could measure. And we're going to sit with a question that still has no settled answer, even now. What did the Hawaiians truly believe he was? And did Cook ever understand it? before it's too late. So let us begin where it began, not with the death on the beach, with the ship that looked like a temple rising out of the sea at dawn. To understand what happened in Hawaii, you first have to understand the man standing on that deck, because James Cook was not born to any of this. Almost nothing about his life should have ended with his name on half the maps of the Pacific. He was born in 1728 in a small village in the north of England, the son of a farm labourer. Not a gentleman, not an officer's family, not the kind of birth that opened doors in the rigid world of the 18th century Royal Navy, where command usually went to men with money and connections. Cook had neither. As a boy, he worked in a shop by the sea, and then he went to work on the rough coal ships that hauled their cargo up and down the stormy English coast, some of the most dangerous, unforgiving sailing in the world. That was his school, not an academy. The cold North Sea and the flat-bottomed boats that taught him how shallow water and hidden ground could kill a ship in minutes. And here is the thing about Cook that matters for everything that follows. He was, above all, a man of measurement. He rose through the Navy not by charm or birth, but by being better at the mathematics of navigation, better at charting a coastline, better at turning a wild, unknown shore into precise, reliable lines on paper. He taught himself astronomy. He taught himself the delicate science of fixing a position on the empty ocean. He mapped the coast of Canada so accurately that his charts were still being used generations later. He trusted what he could measure: the angle of a star, the depth of the water, the shape of a coast. Numbers did not lie to him, and he did not lie about them. That was his genius. And as we will see, it may also have been the blind spot that killed him, because the thing waiting for him in Hawaii could not be measured with any instrument he owned. By the time he sailed for the Pacific in 1776, on this third great voyage, Cook was the most famous explorer in the world. He had done what no one else had. On his first two voyages he had charted New Zealand, mapped the eastern coast of Australia, and pushed his ships deep into the freezing waters of the far south, crossing the Antarctic Circle, sailing through ice no European had ever seen, searching for a rumoured southern continent, and proving that the myths about it were wrong. He had kept his crews alive across years at sea in conditions that killed most men, through a stubborn, almost obsessive attention to cleanliness, fresh food, and the health of his sailors, at a time when disease routinely destroyed half a ship's company. But something was different on this third voyage, and the men who sailed with him noticed it. The Cook of the first voyages had been firm but fair, a hard commander, yes, but controlled, patient, careful. The Cook of the third voyage was changing. He grew angrier, faster. His punishments became harsher, less predictable. He flew into rages that startled the men who had served him for years. He drove himself and his crews harder than before. Some historians think he was simply exhausted, worn down by years at sea, by the endless strain of command, perhaps by something failing in his health or his body that we cannot now diagnose across the centuries. Hold on to that. Because the man arriving in Hawaii was the most capable explorer who'd ever lived, and he was also, quietly, not quite himself, a great navigator with something coming loose inside him, and he was sailing, without knowing it, straight into a situation that would demand the one thing he was losing: patience. But we're getting ahead of the story, because before Cook reached those islands, he was chasing a ghost that did not exist. The same ghost that had haunted explorers for 300 years. Cook did not sail halfway around the world to find Hawaii. He did not even know it was there. Hawaii was an accident, a chance stop on the way to something else. and that something else was one of the oldest and most expensive dreams in the history of exploration. They called it the Northwest Passage. The idea was simple, and it had been driving men to their deaths for centuries. Somewhere across the top of North America, it was believed, there had to be a sea route, a passage of open water that would let a ship sail from the Atlantic to the Pacific across the frozen roof of the world, instead of making the brutal months-long journey around the bottom of the Americas. Whoever found it would hold the key to the trade of the world, a shortcut between the oceans, a road worth more than gold. For 300 years, men had sailed north looking for it. Ships were crushed in the ice, crews vanished into the white. Whole expeditions sailed out and were never heard from again, swallowed by a passage that, in the form they imagined, simply was not there. But the dream would not die, because the reward was too enormous to give up. By the 1770s, the British thought they would try a new approach. Instead of hunting for the passage from the Atlantic side where so many had failed, they would send their best man to find it from the other end, from the Pacific. Sail into the Pacific, work up the west coast of North America, and search for the western mouth of the passage. And there was only one man for a job like that, the best navigator in the world, James Cook. So Cook's real mission had nothing to do with tropical islands. His orders were to cross the Pacific and probe the cold northern coast of America for a way through the ice. Hawaii was simply in the way, a place to stop, take on fresh water and food, and rest the crews before the hard work in the north began. And this is the first quiet irony of the whole story. The most consequential thing James Cook ever did in the Pacific, arriving in Hawaii, was to him a footnote, a supply stop, a minor entry in the log on the way to the real prize. He had no idea that the frozen passage he was chasing did not exist, just as it never had. And he had no idea that the minor islands he was about to brush against would be the ones to end him. When his two ships, the Resolution and the Discovery, sighted the islands in January 1778, Cook did what Cook always did. He observed, he measured, he noted the position with care. He named the group the Sandwich Islands, after one of his patrons back in England, a name that meant absolutely nothing to the hundreds of thousands of people who already lived there and had their own names for every island, every bay, every mountain, and every current. Because that is the thing the word discovery always hides. Cook did not discover an empty place. He arrived at a world that was already full, already ancient, already complete, already home. And to understand what happened when he stepped ashore, we have to turn away from the ship for a while and look at the islands the way they truly were before the sails appeared on the horizon. The Hawaiian islands that Cook stumbled onto were not a scattering of simple villages waiting to be found. They were the far frontier of one of the greatest seafaring achievements in the entire history of the human species, and almost no one in Europe had any idea it existed. Think about where Hawaii sits. It is the most isolated major island chain on Earth. Thousands of miles of open ocean in every direction, farther from any continent than almost any inhabited place on the planet. And yet, when Cook arrived, hundreds of thousands of people were living there in a rich and ordered society with agriculture, religion, law, art, and history stretching back centuries. How did they get there? Not by accident. The ancestors of the Hawaiians were Polynesians, the greatest ocean navigators the world has ever produced. Centuries before any European dared to sail out of sight of land, Polynesian voyagers were crossing thousands of miles of open Pacific in great double-hulled canoes, carrying people, animals, and plants settling islands scattered across an expanse of ocean larger than any empire in history. They did it without compasses, without charts, without a single written instrument. They navigated by the stars, by the shapes of ocean swells, by the flight paths of birds, by the colour of the sky, by the way the water moved against the hull. They carried the map in their minds and in their memory, passed down through generations of trained navigators. Sit with that for a moment, in the dark. While Europe was still mostly hugging its own coastlines, afraid of the open Atlantic, Pacific Islanders had already found and settled the most remote specks of land on the face of the planet, across a stretch of ocean that covers nearly half the world. When Cook's sailors looked at the Hawaiians and saw people with no iron and simple clothing, they thought they were seeing something primitive. They were, in fact, standing in front of the descendants of the boldest navigators who had ever lived. People whose ancestors had solved a problem of open ocean travel that Europe would not match for centuries, and the world these voyagers had built in Hawaii was complex and complete. The land was divided into carefully managed sections that ran from the mountains to the sea, each one containing everything a community needed: high forest, farmland, fresh water, and fishing grounds. They built elaborate irrigation systems and fish ponds along the coast, engineering the land and the shallows to feed a large population. They grew taro, sweet potato, breadfruit, banana, and sugar cane. They were not scratching at survival. They had surplus, specialists, and time. The things that let a civilization build temples and develop art and turn its attention to the gods. And their society was ordered by a system as intricate and as rigid, in its own way, as anything in Europe. At the top were the alii, the chiefs, the nobility, believed to be descended from the gods themselves, carrying sacred power in their very bodies. Below them were the common people, the farmers and fishermen and craftsmen. And running through everything, governing every part of daily life, was a powerful system of sacred law known as kapu, a web of things forbidden and things required, of what was sacred and what was profane, of who could eat what, who could touch what, who could look at whom. To break a serious kapu was not a small thing. It could cost you your life. The whole world was charged with sacred power, and that power had rules. Hold all of this in your mind, because it is the key to everything that follows. When James Cook stepped ashore, he did not step onto a blank beach. He stepped into an ancient and ordered world, governed by gods and chiefs and sacred law. A world with a place for everything, and a story ready and waiting to explain the arrival of something as impossible as a floating temple crowned with fire. The Hawaiians did not have to invent a way to understand Cook. Their world already had a shape for him. And that shape had a name. Its name was Lono. To understand what the Hawaiians may have seen when Cook's ships appeared, you have to understand Lono. Because Lono was not a minor spirit. He was one of the four great gods of the Hawaiian world. Lono was the god of peace, of fertility, of agriculture, of rain, and the growth of crops. He was the god you turn to for the harvest, for the abundance of the land, for the gentle side of existence rather than the harsh one. And every year the Hawaiians honoured Lono in a long and sacred festival, a season of celebration that shaped the entire rhythm of their calendar. It was called the Makahiki. The Makahiki was a time unlike any other in the Hawaiian year. For roughly 4 months, across the wet season, the ordinary rules of life were suspended. War was forbidden. The everyday work and the harsher demands of the gods were set aside. It was a season of peace, of feasting, of games and sport and ceremony, of collecting tribute from across the land and offering it up in thanks. During the makahiki, an image of Lono was carried in a great procession around the whole island, a sacred pole hung with white cloth and offerings, moving clockwise around the coast, stopping at each district to receive the gifts of the people. White banners, a tall crossbar draped with long white sheets of bark cloth, spread wide like, and hold this image in your mind, like the wings of something, or the sails of something. Now, picture the timing. James Cook's ships arrived in the Hawaiian Islands during the makahiki season, the season of Lono, the very time of year when the god of peace and abundance was expected to return to the land and travel its coast. And on his second fateful visit a year later, Cook's ships would sail into the Great Bay on the island of Hawaii, sailing as it happened in a clockwise direction around the coast, the same direction as the sacred procession of Lono. They would drop anchor in a bay that was one of the most sacred places associated with Lono himself during the season of Lono, flying great sheets of white cloth from their masts spread wide against the sky. Do you see it now? Do you see what the Hawaiians may have seen? A being arrives from across the sea, from beyond the edge of the known world, exactly during the season when the god of that sea and that abundance is due to return. He comes in a vast floating structure hung with white cloth, like the white cloth of Lono's own banners. He moves around the island in the sacred direction, and he anchors at Lono's own sacred harbour. To a people whose entire world was charged with sacred meaning, whose religion had prepared them for exactly this kind of return, the pattern must have seemed overwhelming. The signs lined up too perfectly to be accident. Here was Lono, or something of Lono, come back to the land as the old stories said he would. And so, according to many accounts, that is how they received him. When Cook came ashore at the Great Bay on his second visit, he was met not with fear or hostility, but with reverence. Thousands upon thousands of people gathered, one estimate says 10,000, crowding the shore, filling the water with canoes, climbing the hills to see. Priests took Cook by the hand and led him to their sacred temple. They wrapped him in red cloth. They had him perform, or performed around him, elaborate and solemn ceremonies. They prostrated themselves as he passed, falling to the ground the way they did for the highest sacred power. They called him again and again by a single name, Lono. And here we arrive at the question at the very heart of this whole story. The question that historians and scholars are still arguing about today, more than 200 years later, sometimes bitterly. It is a question we are going to hold and turn over and sit with, but we are not going to pretend we can fully answer it. Because no one can. Not really. Did the Hawaiians actually believe James Cook was the god Lono? Here is where honesty matters more than a good story. Because the easy version, the one you'll find in a lot of old books, is that yes, the simple Hawaiians saw the ships, decided a god had arrived, worshipped Cook as Lono, and later killed him when they discovered he was only a man, clean, dramatic, satisfying. But that version has a problem, and the problem is that it may say more about the Europeans who told it than about the Hawaiians who lived it. Think about who wrote the accounts we have. They were written by Cook's officers, by British sailors, by Europeans who did not speak the Hawaiian language, didn't understand the Hawaiian religion, and had every reason in the world to like the idea that they were so magnificent, so obviously superior, that the local people had mistaken them for gods. It is a very flattering story to tell about yourself. They thought we were divine. Sailors carried that story home, and it spread, and it hardened into fact, and so a real and serious argument has grown up around it. On one side are scholars who take the God story seriously, who point out that the timing with the makahiki was real, the ceremonies at the temple were real, the name Lono was real, the prostrations were real, and that within the Hawaiian religious world, it made complete sense to understand a being like Cook in sacred terms. In this view, the Hawaiians were not being childish or gullible. They were doing exactly what any deeply religious society does, interpreting an astonishing event through the framework of their own beliefs, a framework that genuinely had a place for the return of Lono. On the other side are scholars who push back hard. They argue that the whole Cook as God story is largely a European invention, a piece of flattering myth-making that reveals colonial arrogance more than Hawaiian belief. They argue it insults the intelligence of the Hawaiians to imagine they looked at a boatload of tired, hungry, sunburned sailors trading nails for food and concluded they were divine. They point out that Lono may have meant something more complex than the English word God, that Hawaiian chiefs themselves were considered to carry sacred godlike power, that calling Cook Lono might have placed him somewhere in that sacred order, without meaning he was literally the god in the way a European would understand it. And the truth is, we cannot climb inside the minds of the people on that beach in 1779. We have their actions, filtered through the pens of strangers who did not understand them. We do not have their thoughts in their own words. The Hawaiians of that moment left us no written account of what they truly believed they were looking at. So we are left with something better than a simple answer. We're left with a real mystery. Somewhere between they thought he was a god and they thought no such thing lies the truth. A truth tangled up in a religion the sailors could not read, a language they could not speak, and a sacred order they never even knew was there. What we can say is this: something about the pattern of Cook's arrival carried enormous meaning in the Hawaiian world, enough meaning that thousands gathered, enough meaning that priests led him to the temple, enough meaning that the name Lono followed him everywhere he went, and enough meaning that, when the pattern later broke, the consequences would be deadly. Because here is the thing about being received as something sacred. It is not a safe place to stand. A god who behaves as he should is honoured, but a god who breaks the pattern, who returns at the wrong time, who reveals himself to be weak or greedy or mortal, that is not just a disappointment, that is a dangerous thing, a wrongness in the sacred order that has to be set right. And Cook was about to break the pattern in every way possible, but we are moving too fast. Let's go back to that first arrival in January 1778 and walk through what actually happened when these two worlds first touched, because the very first contact already carried the seeds of everything that came later. On that first visit, Cook did not land at the great bay that would become so important. His ships first made contact at the island of Kauai, at the western end of the chain, and the first meetings were, by the accounts we have, cautious and full of wonder on both sides. The Hawaiians paddled out to the ships in their canoes, staring at these strange floating structures and the pale men who crewed them. They were fascinated above all by one thing the Europeans carried: iron. Iron was almost unknown in Hawaii. A few scraps had perhaps drifted ashore over the centuries on driftwood or wreckage, precious and rare. And here were these strangers with iron everywhere. Iron tools, iron nails, iron that could hold an edge and change everything about the hard work of carving wood and cultivating land. The Hawaiians wanted it desperately, and the sailors, for their part, quickly discovered what they wanted in return. because here is one of the first hard human truths of the encounter, and the sailors' own journals record it plainly. The Hawaiian women came out to the ships, and the sailors traded iron nails for sex. A nail, a common iron nail, could be worth more in that moment than almost anything, and the exchange became so common that Cook, worried about it, tried to control it. He was afraid, and he was right to be afraid, of the sailors carrying disease into the population, because that is the invisible thing that came ashore with Cook's ships. Not just iron and cloth and strange faces. Disease. The sailors of the Pacific voyages carried illnesses that had never touched these isolated islands, including venereal diseases and worse. The Hawaiians, like the peoples of the Americas before them, had lived in isolation for so long that their bodies had no defense against the sicknesses the Europeans carried as casually as the nails in their pockets. Cook himself, in his journals, agonized about this. He tried to keep sick men off the shore. He understood dimly that he might be introducing something terrible into a place that had welcomed him. He was right. In the decades after Cook, introduced diseases would sweep through the Hawaiian Islands with catastrophic force. The population that had numbered in the hundreds of thousands when Cook arrived would collapse over the following century, falling by enormous margins, community after community hollowed out by sicknesses that no one in Hawaii had ever seen before, and no one's body knew how to fight. Cook did not intend this. He tried, in his limited way, to prevent it. But it came anyway, riding in the bodies of his men, and it may have been the single most consequential thing his ships ever brought to those islands, far more lasting than any map, any name, any flag. So even in that first bright moment of contact, the wonder, the iron, the exchange of gifts, the mutual fascination, the shadow was already there. Two worlds that had developed apart for 1,000 years were touching, and the touching itself carried a cost that no one on either side could see. The Hawaiians could see faces and sails and iron. They could not see the microscopic thing moving invisibly from body to body, the thing that would do more to end their old world than any weapon. Cook stayed only a short while on that first visit. He took on water and food, traded, observed, recorded, and then he sailed north, away from the islands to get on with his real mission, the search for the passage that did not exist. He spent most of the next year in the far north, probing the cold coasts of America and Asia, battering against walls of ice, finding no passage, finding only the hard proof that the dream was a lie. Worn down, defeated in the north, he turned his ships back toward the warm islands he'd found to rest and resupply before trying again. He was coming back to Hawaii, and this time he would arrive at the Great Bay, during the Makahiki, in the sacred season of Lono. This time, the pattern would complete itself, and this time he would not sail away. In late January 1779, almost exactly a year after he first found the islands, Cook's two ships came back to Hawaii, and this time they sailed along the coast of the largest island, the one called Hawaii itself, looking for a safe harbour to anchor and repair and rest. They found it in a place called Kealakekua Bay. Of all the bays on all the islands where Cook might have dropped anchor, he chose this one, and he had no way of knowing what it was. Kealakekua was one of the most sacred harbours in all the islands, a place deeply associated with the god Lono. Its very name has been understood to mean something like the pathway of the god, and Cook sailed his white-winged ships into it during the Makahiki, the season of Lono, after travelling around the island in the same direction as Lono's own sacred procession. The pattern, which had been suggestive on the first visit, now completed itself with a force that must have felt overwhelming to anyone watching from the shore, and the response was unlike anything Cook's men had ever seen anywhere in the Pacific. The people came in numbers that staggered the sailors, the bay filled with canoes, hundreds of them, thousands of people, until the water itself seemed to disappear beneath them. They swarmed the shore. They climbed onto the ships in such numbers that the officers feared the vessels might capsize under the weight. They swam out and surrounded the hulls. One of Cook's officers estimated that 10,000 people had gathered to witness the arrival. The sailors, hardened men who had seen island after island across 2 great oceans, wrote that they had never experienced a reception like it in all their years at sea. And it was not chaos, it was reverence. When Cook came ashore, he was met by priests who took him and led him through a series of solemn, elaborate ceremonies. They brought him to the sacred temple. They draped him in red cloth, the colour of the sacred, the colour of the gods and the highest chiefs. They led him through rituals, chanting, offering, guiding his hands and his body through the motions of something the sailors could only partly describe and could not understand at all. And everywhere Cook went, the people prostrated themselves, dropping flat to the ground as he passed, the gesture reserved for the most sacred power, for a chief or a god so charged with divine force that an ordinary person could not even stand upright in his presence. And over it all, that name again, Lono, called out, murmured, chanted. Lono had come to Kealakekua in the season of Lono by the pathway of the god. Cook, for his part, seems to have accepted the ceremonies with a kind of patient, uncomprehending politeness. He let the priest lead him. He sat through the long rituals. He allowed the red cloth and the offerings. What did he think was happening? We cannot fully know. He was a practical man in a strange place, being honoured by his hosts in ways he did not understand, and he did what a careful commander does. He went along with it, kept the peace, and got on with the urgent business of his voyage, repairing his ships, taking on water and food, and resting his exhausted men. He may have thought it was simply the local style of welcome. He may have sensed that something larger was going on and decided not to disturb it, since it worked so entirely in his favour, because it did work in his favour, spectacularly. The Hawaiians gave the ships everything they needed: pigs, vegetables, fruit, water, in enormous quantities. They provisioned Cook's expedition with a generosity that no ordinary trade could explain. Whatever the sailors were receiving, they were receiving it because of who the Hawaiians believed, or half believed, or ceremonially treated them to be. But here is the quiet danger that was building underneath all of it, and it is the same danger we named before. A sacred welcome comes with sacred expectations. If the Hawaiians were honouring Cook within the framework of the makahiki, within the story of Lono, then that story had a shape, and the shape had an ending. The makahiki season does not last forever. Lono comes and is honoured, and then the season turns and Lono departs, and the world returns to its ordinary order, the order of a different god, a harsher god, the god of war and of the ruling chiefs. Cook did not know he was inside a story. He did not know the story had a calendar. And he did not know that he was about to overstay his welcome in the most dangerous way imaginable, by lingering past the end of the sacred season, and then, worse, by leaving and coming back at exactly the wrong moment. The pattern that had raised him up was about to turn against him. For 2 or 3 weeks the arrangement held, and it was good for everyone. The Hawaiians honoured their sacred guest. The sailors rested and repaired and ate better than they had in months. Cook's men explored, traded, and were treated with a hospitality that seemed almost boundless. But it was not, in fact, boundless, and slowly the strain began to show. Feeding 10,000 gathered people and provisioning 2 hungry ships is an enormous burden on a local economy, even a rich one. The endless demands of the sailors for food, for wood, for water, began to press hard on the resources of the district around the bay. What had begun as sacred generosity started gradually to become a drain. Some of the Hawaiian chiefs and priests began, politely but unmistakably, to wonder when their divine visitors might be moving on. And there was friction of other kinds. The sailors behaved as sailors did. There were tensions over theft. The Hawaiians took objects from the ships, iron and tools and anything else that could be carried off, which to them may not have been theft in the European sense at all, but something closer to the taking of tribute, or simply the natural claiming of goods from a source of astonishing wealth. To the British, it was stealing, and it angered them. There were misunderstandings, small confrontations, a rising sense on both sides that the other was not behaving correctly. And underneath it, the calendar was turning. The Makahiki season was ending. The time of Lono, the time of peace and abundance, was giving way to the return of the ordinary order, and to the season of the sterner gods, the gods of the chiefs and of war. Whatever sacred role Cook had occupied, its time was running out. The story was reaching the point where Lono was supposed to depart, and then, at last, Cook did what the story required. In early February, his ships raised anchor and sailed out of Kealakekua Bay, heading away from the island. Right on schedule, in a sense. The sacred visitor was leaving as the sacred season closed. Had that been the end of it? Had Cook simply sailed away and never returned, the story might have completed itself cleanly. Lono came, was honoured, and departed, the pattern intact, the visit remembered as a wonder. But that is not what happened. Because a few days out from the bay, sailing north, Cook's ships ran into a violent storm, and the Resolution, Cook's own ship, was damaged. The foremast was sprung, cracked, in urgent need of repair. Cook had no good options. He needed a safe harbour, sheltered water, a place to bring the mast ashore and fix it. And the nearest such place, the harbour he knew, the harbour that had just given him everything, was Kealakekua Bay. So he turned his ships around, and he sailed back into the sacred bay. Sit with what this meant, from the Hawaiian side, if the sacred framework was real to them. Lono had come, in his season, and been honoured, and departed as he should. The story was complete. And then suddenly, unexpectedly, out of season, the god came back, returned when he was not supposed to return, broke the pattern, sailed back into the pathway of the god after the pathway was supposed to be closed. What does it mean when a god returns at the wrong time? It is not a joyful thing. It is a wrongness, a disturbance in the sacred order, something out of place, something that does not fit the story, something that might even be dangerous. And this time, when Cook's ships entered the bay, there were no cheering crowds, no thousands of canoes. The shore was quiet. Something had changed. A sacred prohibition, a kapu, had been placed on the bay. The warmth was gone. Cook had come back, and he had come back wrong. The final day began with a theft. On the night after Cook's return, one of the ship's boats, a large cutter, an important boat, was taken by the Hawaiians, cut loose from its mooring and carried off, probably for the precious iron in its nails and fittings. And to Cook, this was the last straw in a visit that had already curdled from reverence into friction. Cook had faced this kind of thing before, across years in the Pacific. His usual method in such situations was drastic, but, in his mind, reliable. He would take a hostage. He would seize a chief or a person of importance and hold them on his ship until the stolen item was returned. It had worked for him elsewhere. And so, on the morning of February 14th, 1779, Cook loaded his boats with armed marines, went ashore, and marched up toward the household of the great chief of the island, an old and respected ruler named Kalaniopuu, with a plan to invite him aboard the ship and, if necessary, to take him by force and hold him until the cutter was returned. At first it seemed it might work. The old chief agreed, apparently trustingly, to come down to the boats with Cook. He walked with him toward the shore, but as they came down to the water something shifted. The chief's wife and others pleaded with him not to go. They could sense danger. The chief hesitated and sat down on the ground, refusing to go further. And meanwhile, word was spreading through the district of something else, that in another part of the bay, a Hawaiian chief of high rank had just been shot and killed by Cook's men who were blockading the bay. The mood turned in an instant. A crowd began to gather around Cook and his handful of marines on the shore, a crowd that swelled into the thousands, angry now, grieving, no longer reverent at all. The sailors were suddenly a tiny cluster of armed men on a beach surrounded by a furious multitude. Cook realized the hostage plan had failed. He began to pull back toward the boats, trying to withdraw his men to the water. And then it happened, fast, the way these things always happen. A warrior threatened Cook or moved toward him. Cook fired. He had a gun loaded with shot, and the shot failed to penetrate the thick protective mat the warrior carried, which only enraged and emboldened the crowd, because it seemed to prove that this being could be resisted. Stones flew. The Marines fired a ragged volley, and the crowd, instead of scattering, surged forward. In the chaos at the water's edge, Cook was struck. Some accounts say he was hit on the head with a club. Some say he was stabbed with an iron dagger, one of the very iron blades the Hawaiians had gotten from the Europeans themselves. He staggered, fell into the shallow water at the edge of the beach, and there, in the surf, he was overwhelmed. The greatest navigator in the history of the world died face down in knee-deep water, on the shore of an island he had stumbled onto by accident, killed by the people who had, only days before, treated him as something close to a god. Several of his marines died with him on that beach. The rest scrambled into the boats and pulled away, out to the ships, leaving Cook's body behind on the shore in the hands of the Hawaiians. It was over in minutes. The man who had crossed and mapped the greatest ocean on earth, who had survived the ice of both ends of the world, who'd kept his crews alive through years at sea, was gone, killed in a sudden, chaotic, almost accidental collision on a beach, in a confrontation over a stolen boat that had spiraled, in the space of an hour, from a hostage plan into a massacre. But even in death the strangeness was not finished. Because what the Hawaiians did with Cook's body would tell the sailors, in a language they could barely read, just how sacred and how complicated the thing they had been part of truly was. When the ships pulled back from the shore in shock and grief, the British desperately wanted one thing: Cook's body, so they could bury their commander at sea in the manner of the Navy. But the Hawaiians had taken it, and what they did with it has been one of the most misunderstood parts of the whole story. To the horrified sailors, hearing fragments of what had happened, it sounded like desecration. Cook's body, they learned, had been carried away, taken up into the hills, and there it had been treated in a way that appalled them. The flesh separated from the bones, the body dismembered, parts of it distributed among the chiefs, the bones cleaned. To European eyes, This was the ultimate horror, the enemy defiling the corpse of their captain. But that is a misreading, because what the Hawaiians did to Cook's body was not the treatment of a hated enemy. It was almost certainly the treatment reserved for the most sacred and honoured dead, for a high chief, or for a god. In Hawaiian practice, the bodies of the greatest chiefs were treated exactly this way. The flesh was carefully removed and the bones preserved, because the bones were understood to hold mana, the sacred power, the divine life force of the person. The bones of a great chief were sacred objects, kept and honoured and hidden away, precisely because they contained so much power. To dismember Cook and preserve his bones was not to destroy him. It was to treat him as something far too sacred to simply bury, to treat him, in the end, the way you would treat the remains of a chief of the highest rank or of a god. Think about what that tells us. Even in the act of killing him, even in the fury and grief and chaos of that beach, the Hawaiians were still apparently treating Cook as sacred. The killing and the reverence were tangled together in a way that the British simply could not comprehend. They had watched their captain be struck down by a mob, and then they learned his body had been given the rights of a god. To them it was madness, savagery, contradiction. To the Hawaiians it may have been entirely coherent, the necessary dangerous business of dealing with a sacred being who had come out of season and broken the pattern, and whose sacred power now had to be properly, carefully handled. Some of Cook's bones were eventually returned to the ship after negotiation and were buried at sea. Others were kept by the Hawaiians and honoured, and, according to some accounts, treated as sacred objects for years afterward, brought out during the very Makahiki festival of Lono, carried in the procession of the god. If that is true, then the story completed itself in the strangest possible way. Cook, who had sailed into the season of Lono and been received as Lono, whose arrival had matched the sacred pattern so perfectly, Cook, in the end, became part of the ritual of Lono himself. His bones carried in the god's own procession year after year. The British officers who survived recorded their confusion in their journals. They noted that some Hawaiians grieved for Cook and seemed genuinely to mourn him. They noted that others asked repeatedly when Lono would return, and whether, when he came back, he would be angry and punish them for what had been done. Read that again and feel the weight of it. Even after killing him, some of them were still waiting for him to come back, still half expecting the god to return, still living inside a story the sailors had never even known they were part of. And that, more than anything, is the answer to our question, or as close to an answer as we will ever get. We asked whether the Hawaiians believed Cook was a god, and the truest response the evidence allows is this: it was complicated and sacred and real enough that they honoured him as one, killed him in circumstances tangled with that sacred role, gave his body the rights of a god, and then waited, some of them, for him to come back. Whatever Lono meant to them, and it may not have meant exactly what the English word God means to us, it meant enough to shape everything that happened in that bay, from the 10,000 who gathered to welcome him to the hands that prepared his bones. Step back now from the beach and ask the harder question. Not what the Hawaiians believed, but why it ended in blood at all. Because reverence does not usually turn into killing in the space of a few days. Something drove it, and there is no single, simple answer. Only a collision of forces, all of them pressing at once. Start with the timing, because the timing may be the deepest cause of all. If Cook truly was received within the framework of Lono, then everything depended on the calendar. He arrived in the season of Lono and was honoured. He left as the season closed, as he should, and then he came back, out of season, into the time of the war god, when a peaceful sacred visitor had no place. A god who returns at the wrong time is not a blessing. He is an anomaly, a disturbance, perhaps a threat. Some scholars have argued that this alone doomed him, that by sailing back into that bay after the pattern had closed, Cook stepped, without knowing it, out of the role that had protected him and into the role of something that had to be confronted. Then add the ordinary human frictions which needed no religion at all. The strain of provisioning the ships had worn out the district's patience. The thefts and the punishments had built resentment on both sides. The sailors were tired and short-tempered. Cook himself, as we saw, was not the patient commander he had once been. On that final morning his judgment failed him. The hostage plan was a gamble that had worked before, but this time he tried it against the highest chief of the island, in front of a grieving, frightened, growing crowd, at the exact moment when, unknown to him, his men had just killed another chief elsewhere in the bay. It was the worst possible move at the worst possible moment. And then there is the simplest, most human factor of all. It may have been, in the end, partly an accident, a confrontation that no one fully planned, spiralling out of control faster than anyone could stop it. A gun fired that failed to kill, emboldening the crowd, a stone thrown, a dagger drawn, a surge of bodies. These things have their own terrible momentum, and once they begin, no one is truly in command of them anymore. Not the great navigator, not the old chief, not the priests, no one. 100 small things went wrong at once, and a man died in the surf. So which was it? Sacred logic? The god who broke the pattern? Political and economic strain? The guests who overstayed? Cook's own failing judgment? The tired commander who made a fatal blunder? Or simple, chaotic accident? The confrontation that got out of hand? The honest answer is that it was probably all of them, braided together, impossible to fully separate. And that is what makes it a true historical mystery, rather than a simple morality tale. There is no villain here in the way the old stories wanted one. There is no single mistake you can point to and say, there, that is the cause. There is only a collision. Two worlds that could not read each other, meeting at a moment when every current was running the wrong way, and neither side able to see the whole of what was happening until it was already over. Cook was dead, but his ship sailed on. His officers finished the mission as best they could, made one more futile attempt at the northern passage, found only ice again, and finally turned for home, carrying the news of their commander's death back to a Britain that would receive it with shock and grief. Cook was mourned as a national hero, the greatest explorer of the age, struck down at the far edge of the world. But the most important thing Cook's ships left behind was not grief, and not glory, and not even the maps, though the maps were extraordinary, and they redrew the world's picture of the Pacific. The most important thing they left behind was the one thing no one could see. They had opened the door to Hawaii, and through that door, everything would now come. Before Cook, Hawaii had been sealed away by thousands of miles of ocean, hidden, isolated, unknown to the wider world. After Cook, the position of the islands was on every chart, and Hawaii sat, it turned out, in an incredibly useful spot, a place to resupply in the middle of the vast Pacific, right on the emerging trade routes between the Americas and Asia. Within a few years of Cook's death, more ships began to come. Traders, whalers, merchants, then missionaries, then settlers. The isolation that had protected Hawaii for 1,000 years was gone, and it would never come back. And with the ships came the invisible cargo we spoke of before: disease. Across the decades after Cook, wave after wave of introduced sickness swept through the Hawaiian people, who had no immunity to any of it. The numbers are staggering and heartbreaking. The population that may have numbered several 100,000 when Cook arrived collapsed over the following century, falling by the vast majority, whole communities emptied out by diseases that had ridden in on the trade Cook's arrival had opened. It was the same catastrophe that had struck the peoples of the Americas after 1492, playing out again on these islands. A biological collision that no one intended and no one could stop. The old world that Cook had sailed into, the world of the chiefs and the kapu and the great gods, the world that had a place ready for a being like Lono, was fatally wounded by the contact. Within a few decades of Cook's death, that entire sacred order would be transformed almost beyond recognition, as disease, foreign influence, new weapons, new religion, and new power reshaped the islands. A Hawaiian king would eventually unite all the islands under one rule, using in part the guns and the knowledge that had come from the outside world. The old system of kapu would be overthrown from within. The missionaries would arrive and begin the long work of replacing the old gods. The Hawaii that Cook first saw, the Hawaii of 10,000 people gathering to welcome a god in the season of Lono, was, in a real sense, already ending the moment his sails appeared on the horizon. This is the thing the word discovery can never hold. Cook did not discover an empty land and open it to history. He arrived at a world that was already whole, already ancient, already complete, already home to a people with 1,000 years of ocean behind them, and a rich, ordered, living civilization all their own. And the moment of contact, for all its wonder, began the unravelling of that world. Both things are true at once. It was one of the last great meetings of two human worlds that had never known each other, and it was the beginning of the end for one of them. What are we to make of James Cook himself, then, when it is all over? For a long time, the answer was simple, at least in Britain and much of the West. Cook was a hero, the greatest of all explorers, a self-made genius of navigation, a man of science and courage who charted the unknown and expanded the boundaries of human knowledge. Statues were raised to him. His name went on to straits and inlets and islands and mountains all across the Pacific and beyond. He became a marble figure gazing out to sea, the very image of the noble explorer, and there is real truth in that. Cook genuinely was a navigator of extraordinary skill, perhaps the greatest who ever lived. He genuinely did map vast stretches of the world with an accuracy that had never been achieved before. He genuinely did care about his men and pioneered methods that kept them alive when other commanders lost half their crews. He was brave, brilliant, disciplined, and in many ways humane by the standards of his time. A poor boy who rose by pure ability in a world built to keep such men down. All of that is real. But in more recent times, especially in Hawaii and across the Pacific, a very different view of Cook has grown, and it too has its truth. In this view, Cook is not a hero, but the man who opened the door to catastrophe. The first edge of a wave of contact that brought disease, dispossession, and the destruction of the old Hawaiian world. To many native Hawaiians today, Cook's arrival is not a triumph to be celebrated, but a wound to be remembered. The moment the outside world found them, and their long unravelling began. His monuments have become contested. The story of the brave discoverer looks very different when it's told from the shore instead of from the deck. So, which is the real Cook? The brilliant, humane navigator, or the harbinger of destruction? And the answer, once again, is that he was both, and that you do not have to choose between them tonight. He was a genuinely great explorer, and his arrival genuinely helped destroy a world. He did not intend the catastrophe. He even, in his fumbling way, tried to prevent some of it, worrying over the diseases men carried. But intentions are not consequences, and the consequences reached across the whole future of the islands. Cook the man was skilled and brave, and at the end tired and failing and fatally out of his depth. Cook the historical force was the crack of a door opening, and everything that came pouring through it after him. You can hold both. The truest stories almost always ask you to, and so we come back at the end to where we began, to the question at the heart of it all, the one that has no settled answer and perhaps never will. What did the Hawaiians really see when they looked at James Cook? We have walked all the way through it now. The ship that looked like a temple, the sacred season, the God who was due to return, the 10,000 who gathered, the priests and the red cloth and the prostrations, the name Lono following him everywhere, the seasons turning, the wrong return, the beach, the death in the surf, the bones treated as the bones of a god. And still, we cannot climb inside their minds and know for certain what they believed. Maybe they saw a god in the fullest sense. Lono returned to the land in the flesh, exactly as the sacred pattern foretold. Maybe they saw something more subtle, a being of great sacred power, a chief among chiefs, something the word God only clumsily translates. Maybe different people saw different things. The priest one thing, the chiefs another, the common people a third. Maybe the whole God story is partly a European fantasy, a flattering myth the sailors told themselves and carried home. Or maybe it is exactly as strange and as real as it looks, and Cook truly did sail into the middle of a living sacred story and play the role of a god without ever understanding the play he was in. We do not know, and there is something right about not knowing, something that fits the true shape of the thing. Because the deepest truth of this whole story is that two worlds met at that bay, and neither could fully read the other. The Hawaiians could not read the tired Englishman who trusted only his charts, and Cook, brilliant practical Cook, who could fix his position from a star and map a coast he had seen only once, could not read the sacred world he had sailed into, could not see the God-shaped space that was waiting to receive him, could not measure the one thing that mattered most. He had instruments for everything except the thing that killed him. That is the real ghost of this story. Not whether he was a god, but the vast, unbridgeable gap between what each side could see, the way two peoples could stand on the same beach, exchange gifts, share food, honor and be honored, and still be living in completely different worlds, telling completely different stories, right up to the moment those stories collided and a man died in the surf. The bay is still there, Kealakekua, on the coast of the island of Hawaii, the pathway of the god. The water is still clear and blue and full of fish. The cliffs still rise behind it. If you go there today, it is a quiet and beautiful place, and you would never guess, from the calm of it, what happened on that shore. There is a monument now, near the water, marking roughly the spot where Cook fell, a white obelisk put up long after his death. The waves that rocked his ships are long gone. The 10,000 who gathered are gone. The priest who led him to the temple, the chief who sat down on the ground rather than go to the boats, the warrior who struck the first blow, the hands that carried his body up into the hills and prepared his bones. All of them are gone, centuries gone, and the bay holds its silence over all of it. But the descendants of the people who met Cook on that shore are still there. The Hawaiians did not vanish, however much disease and dispossession took from them. Their language, nearly extinguished, has been carried forward and revived. Their traditions, their chants, their navigation, their memory of the world before the ships. These survive, and in recent generations they have grown louder and stronger, reclaimed with pride. The old sacred order that met Cook is gone, but the people are not gone. They remember, and they tell the story of Cook's arrival in their own way now, not as the moment they were discovered, because they were never lost, but as the moment the outside world came to them, for good and for ill, and everything began to change. And somewhere in that telling, the old question still lives. What did our ancestors see when the ship that looked like a temple came out of the sea? A god? A man? Something in between? Something the strangers never had a word for? The Hawaiians who met Cook took the answer with them into the silence, and we are left, all these centuries later, still standing on the shore of that mystery, looking out at the same blue water, wondering, so rest now. The ship has anchored in the sacred bay. The 10,000 have gone home across the water. This season of Lono has turned, as it always turns, and the god has departed as he always departs. And the questions that remain are the gentle kind, the kind that do not need answering tonight, the kind you can let drift out with the tide into the dark. You do not have to decide as you fall asleep what the Hawaiians truly believed. You do not have to decide whether Cook was a hero or a harbinger, a great man or a fatal one. You can let it all remain as it truly is, complicated and human and unresolved. Two worlds that met on a beach and could not read each other. A man who could measure everything except the thing that mattered. A god who came out of season. A mystery that keeps its answer still. If this long journey across the water was worth taking, you can tap the like button gently, just as a quiet signal that you would like more nights like this one. And if you would like to keep travelling with me through the hidden undersides of the stories we think we know, you can subscribe, and I will keep finding these old, strange, true things and bringing them to you in the dark. And if you feel moved to leave a comment, tell me once more where in the world you're listening from tonight, and what the land or the sea outside your window is like. Ocean or mountain or desert, or the glow of a sleepless city. Because every shore on earth was known and named and loved by someone, long before the maps we use today were ever drawn. And every one of them holds a story as deep as this one, if we only knew how to listen for it. Let the ship ride at anchor. Let the bay grow quiet. Let the old story settle over the water like mist, and let the gods sleep at last in the pathway that bears his name. The bay is still there. It was always there. It did not need to be discovered to be real, and neither did the people who lived beside it, long before the strange white sails came out of the eastern sea. Sleep well. The ocean will keep. The islands will keep. And the old, unanswerable question will still be here, quietly, in the morning. Rest now. Let the warm sea do its slow, quiet work in your dreams.